What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Senior Tech. Today we're going to talk about the differences between .NET Core and .NET Framework, and we're going to talk about a little bit of the architectural differences, use purposes, and some of the definitions. Stay tuned. Today we're going to learn about what is the .NET Framework, what is CLR, what CLR execution model is, what is .NET Core, what are the differences between .NET and .NET Core. So the .NET Framework is a software development platform developed by Microsoft for building and running Windows applications. It consists of developer tools, programming, desktop and web applications, in addition to the use of building websites, web services, mobile apps, and games. Now, this is essential because there are different languages that can accomplish this or these tasks. And Windows solution or Microsoft solution was to just create a common language runtime environment that can actually take all these languages and build native code to run on Windows using any of them. For example, some of these .NET compliant are C#, F#, VB.NET, C++.NET. Let's take a closer look at how the .NET framework is architectured. How did Microsoft really accomplish this, right? And this is a very, very simplified diagram here. We see the languages on the left side. So for example, VBNet, C#net, or other .NET compliant languages that get spun into the common intermediate language, which is the CLR code, that then gets basically converted into native machine code. And native machine code is just, like an executable for Windows, like a .exe or a DLL, for example, right? So let's dive a little bit deeper and see how this is actually done using the .NET framework. The framework accomplishes pushing native code in two ways. The first way using managed code, and the second way is unmanaged code. Let's first talk about managed code. Managed code usually is the route that the .NET framework takes when a .NET compliant source code or language is used. So if you're using C#, F#, VB.NET, right? So let's take a look at what happens really. So the developer comes in, you write your source code, then it gets compiled. The compiler, the .NET compiler, handles the source code and then pushes out something called managed code or assembly, right? Or MSIL. Then this MSIL gets passed to the common language runtime environment that's got something called a JIT compiler or just-in-time compiler, JIT. And this compiler here compiles the code into native code that runs on the operating system. So in other words, you write your code gets compiled in assembly code, and then the common language runtime compiler, the JIT compiler, turns that code into a code that actually the machine can understand and execute. So in the Windows platform case, it gets basically, the bottom line is a .exe or a DLL. So what happens when the code or the language used is not .NET compliant? Well, simply it gets compiled into an unmanaged code, which means it gets directly compiled into native code. So if you write a program using C, C++, VB, something that's not .NET compliant, what happens is the compiler just compiles the program and pushes out a .exe or a DLL immediately. So let's take a more overview, like a more in-depth look. So here's like a more overall look of what really happens in the .NET framework. And this illustrates both the managed and unmanaged code here. So on the right side, we see how your managed code works. So C#, VBNet, or something else that then goes through the .NET application. Then it gets processed through the proper compiler. Then gets pushed out as an assembly code, right? That then runs through the JIT compiler and then gets ran on the operating system. On the left side here, you see, for example, like C++ code, where it goes through the compile time. So this is the actual compiler for C++. This is the normal process for C++ application to be compiled, where it gets compiled, so it gets written, compiled, and then compiled into like a IL code or assembly code, and then it gets ran on the operating system. So this is great and all, but that only talks about the .NET, right? So what about .NET Core? So what is .NET Core? So .NET Core is basically an open source cross-platform, and this is very important. It's open source cross-platform implementation for running websites, services, console application, and mobile apps on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. It's really important to understand this core difference, which is that it's cross-platform open source. Now, aside from that, there isn't really a difference in the IL or JIT process per se. So for example, if you have like an old .NET code, you can actually directly execute that IL and it will work fine with Core, right? They both implement CLI ECMA standard. It's the same thing. Maybe a little bit of differences on like the implementation for the platform, like for example between like it was with .NET, Windows.NET and Mono or something. But the true difference here is in how the .NET is supported, how it's basically truly cross-platform, and that's the main difference. So here we could take a look at the differences like charted between .NET Framework and .NET Core. So as you can see, there's like a little bit of additional support in .NET Core that extends more from the .NET Framework, because essentially what's happening right now is that Microsoft is not going to continue to support the .NET Framework. That's it. .NET Core is going to replace .NET Framework, and you can tell by the versioning of .NET Core. So they ran parallel for a while, but now since .NET Core 5 came out, that's it. So .NET Core 4.7 or 4.8, and that's it. It's done. It's now .NET Core all the way from this point forward. So here are some of the differences, right? They're both a platform, but you can see here that, for example, .NET Framework is not open source, where .NET Core is open source, right? You have to rewrite code if you are going to support different operating systems when it comes to .NET Framework. So if you're trying to target a Linux, you can't use .NET Framework, but you can use the .NET Core framework. So you can build once, and you can actually run on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So .NET Framework doesn't truly support microservices, where the .NET Core does. And here are the main differences, and this is going to answer my final question here, is which should I use? Well, it's for any command line interface, it's just framework, the .NET Framework is too heavy, where your .NET Core isn't. It's pretty fast. So we have speed, we have compatibility, right? So it's faster, it's more compatible, right? And it's got Microsoft and the community back in the .NET Core up. So these are three main reasons where, in my personal opinion, and let me know in the comment section below if you disagree, but these are the three main reasons why I would choose .NET Core versus .NET, aside from talking about future support from Microsoft. It's that community support is really important. Well, thank you for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys on the next one.